Hello everyone, and welcome to this episode of our podcast Getting to Better Together, sponsored by the Centre for International Development, Social Entrepreneurship and Leadership of the University of the Sunshine Coast, and I'm your host Richard Borden. Before proceeding any further, I wish to acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land, the Gubbi Gubbi people, and pay my respect to their elders past, present, and those who will emerge as the future unfolds. And it's to the unfolding future that we again turn our attention in this episode. How do we prepare the young folk of today to assume leadership under tomorrow's circumstances, which we can only currently begin to imagine? Evidence already abounds that they have to deal with critical situations much more pressing and ever more impactful on the world about them than anything that previous generations, including ours of course, have had to face. Almost certainly, for instance, today's climate will be tomorrow's climate crisis. Education will be a major factor for future readiness, and in this regard, what should we be teaching in our schools and universities today? And how should our students be taught? What should be the substance of our curricula for these leaders of the future, and what do we believe that they will need to know in order to be effective leaders under these unfolding circumstances? What processes should we use to best effect, particularly as emerging technologies already continue to transform the way that we communicate with each other? The COVID-19 pandemic has already given some indication of the changes in process that will be necessary in this latter regard, with a focus on e-learning, remote studies, blended learning, virtual classes, and so on. And an increasing embrace of what is being referred to as learning for sustainability, and this is triggering significant changes in the school curriculum. My guest this morning has a number of vital takes on all of these issues, from educational transformation through to the nature and significance of the matter of leadership itself. Don Mcconaughey, who holds the status of Distinguished Companion of the University of the Sunshine Coast, has a lifetime experience with educational reform at schools and at universities alike, which have been informed by very rich theoretical foundations. For all that, his approaches to change in regard to these issues and those like them are firmly grounded in practice. He certainly fulfills the criteria of what might be called a scholar practitioner. So his concerns are not just about identifying what needs to be done, but how we need to act to get them done. A very warm welcome, Don.
Thank you very much, Richard, and thank you for having me.
Over your life's work in education, what major transformations have you noted in the whats and the hows of teaching in our schools and universities in response to changing circumstances in the world about us?
That's a very big question to start with. So a lot of the transformations haven't been very good, as I've observed them, but there's been a counterbalancing development of a whole lot of innovation as well. So perhaps I should mention a bit of both.
Please do.
It seems to me that the words living in a time of education in a time of schooling are very apt. And I think we've confused education with schooling in a lot of ways. And we've put a lot of energy and effort into the schooling side, and therefore we've got basically people who are economists and people who've got political agendas having very big influences over what happens in classrooms at all levels of education. And I think we've seen teachers' influence and the people around them, parents and the community, squeezed out as economists and politicians and their ilk have come to dominate. And that's led to all sorts of negative effects, and we're living through one of them now with the battle over the new version of the national curriculum. And I have a bit of a problem with the whole idea of a national curriculum.
Say more about that.
Well, fundamentally, I think we should give education back to the teachers.
Yeah.
The national curriculum strikes me as just another third level of interference in what is really the professional activity of semi-autonomous professionals who are very well trained and know what they're doing and should be allowed to get on with it. They need to be given the resources and they'll get the job done. Right. But that's not how we treat it. We treat them as if there's something wrong with them, and we need to make things teacher-proof, like curricula. Right. Of course, they're not teacher-proof because no matter what they come up with, the national curriculum, it'll all get worked out at the school level anyway, and the students will have something to say about it as well, and so will the parents and other stakeholders. So this battle that's going on at the moment about a sort of mini history war, again. Yeah. The teachers who teach history will be having a good old chuckle, and life will go on. in the classroom. But it's sad because all of the resources that go into all of this and all of the energy that go into this could be much better used, and teachers would know what to do with those resources if they were given to them.
Right. I recall well, actually, reading about the new history debates, and I recall well when I was a really young kid, 8 or 9, I guess, at primary school, and being introduced to the idea of history and geography and so on. And all the pink bits on the map, we were told, were hours. I'm not quite sure what hours were, but anyway, the sun never set on the British Empire or whatever. And our history was taught within that context of how successful England had been. I was in school in England. And then incredibly factual, like, why did William the Conqueror invade in 1066? And as if you had to say, well, I know that, or the teacher says, I know that. But clearly the teacher didn't know that, and shouldn't take your point. It should have been, that this is an interpretation of, and that's open to question.
Well, at the other end of the colonial exercise, we grew up here in Australia looking at the pink bits on the map, and we were really glad we were a pink bit.
Yeah, you were one of them, that's right, one of the biggest.
And we thought, oh, there's Canada and there's America, so, we're with the strength here. But, of course, as you move into your teens and you start to wake up politically and socially, you start to wonder why we're down under. We've got this sort of down under view of how things worked. But it's still early days, I think, of Australia coming to terms with its Indigenous past. And schooling's where a lot of it will happen, and a lot of it will happen despite what the politicians try to do to stop it, I think.
Right. In a sense, everything then, the more I think about history, and I'm just rereading Josephine Flood's book on the original Australians, which is absolutely fabulous. I mean, it's just politically incorrect in all sorts of different ways, as would be said today. But it's a wonderful anthropological study from which one can then start questioning things like, what do we mean by progress? What do we mean by development? It's
very loaded terms.
Absolutely, yes.
Unfortunately, though, there's a bit of a reaction to the loading that says, well, you shouldn't use those words at all, which leaves us without a language to talk about those things. So I think it's very important to talk about development, but we need to be clear about what we mean about it.
I'm reading another book at the moment which uses the word enoughness.
Yeah.
I think that's gorgeous. That if we but focused on enoughness, and if I then project that back onto my understanding of what Josephine Flood is saying about Aboriginals, that's the way it was.
Well, there was the concept of subsistence affluence, I think.
Yeah. Say more about that.
Well, I don't know a lot about it. It's an anthropological term, I guess, originally, and that's not an area that I've studied. But when I was doing some work in social science in my degree on Papua New Guinea and Australia's relationship involved in the development of Papua New Guinea, the Maconachie Association was having a big battle in Bougainville, and the battle's still going, of course. But I think Bougainville's semi-independent, maybe more than that now. So things have advanced to that extent. But there was an attempt to try and re-establish the importance of the local economy based around agriculture. And the idea of subsistence affluence was an important part of that argument because, well, according to the stuff I was reading, traditional life was terrific. And whilst there were material things missing compared with perhaps life in Australia, that wasn't the way it was felt or perceived. And a lot of things that were highly valued and very important have been destroyed in the process of colonialisation in PNG. And we've seen the campaign in The Guardian in this last 12 months about the destruction of the forests in the Pacific region, including Papua New Guinea, mainly to create flooring timbers for Australian houses.
Which now, ironically, are held up on the docks because they can't export it.
No, that's right. Yes.
For me, it's interesting, again, in this book by Josephine Flood, that the notion of leadership within Aboriginal societies was quite different to those in many other Indigenous societies, where whilst there were elders and there were spirits to inform the elders, there weren't the chiefs that you encounter in Africa and North America and so on. And is that a style of leadership, the sort of notion of collaboration that we should be following?
Well, I believe so. And once again, I don't feel qualified to talk about it from the perspective of traditional societies.
No.
But in terms of our own society, it's pretty clear to me that in the sphere we're talking about, at least in education, if you want to get things done, you need to get people together, arrive at some sorts of reasonably consensus-based decisions and try them out together, and as things work, build on them. As they don't, you change. But the fundamental idea of leaders building the capacity of the people that they're working with, and then in turn building their own capacity so that community becomes more powerful, I just don't see things getting done otherwise. I mean, my own experience here at USC, for instance, over 20 years, USC's been a very active place, growing very fast and trying a lot of new things. Some of it forced on it because it was the only way to get resources into the place, but also quite a lot of people here keen to try stuff out. The stuff that came from on high that was imposed may have been formally completed, but it won't last, or it hasn't lasted, and hasn't changed the way practice occurs in the important areas of the institution. The things that have lasted are the things that people have built from the ground up with support from people who have access to resources and power and ways of supporting them. I think Maria Rossiti's research group is a really fine example of that, and it was a battle for her to be taken seriously in the context of the way we were developing research here through ARC discovery grants and that sort of things, different sort of research that she was starting out with. But her leadership skills are exemplary.
Right. We had Maria on as one of our early episodes.
Right.
And if you look at her as an effective leader, and I certainly would from my conversations with her, what would you point to say, well, that's the sort of leadership we should pursue?
Well, I think she would say this herself as well, is that the fundamental thing about it is that she's authentic and people know that she is. So she's not pulling the wool. She's not running a line. She's not trying to do this for her own aggrandisement.
Right.
She's stuck to her principles and her values.
Right.
And I think she would say that for a while, in desperation, she actually moved away from them a bit in order to try and get on the sort of research ladder. But she soon realised that wasn't going to work either. And since she went back to her basic first principles and worked differently, she was eventually so successful that the system recognised it.
Right. For those who might not have heard that episode, Maria is a professor of social marketing, which means that she is as responsive and responsible to people's reaction to marketing as marketing itself. So it has a sort of social impact, and that's a large part of what it is she's researching. But you might also recall that she was talking about growing into her Aboriginality, and I love that notion in terms of self-awareness. And for me, that's one of the key issues of leadership, self-awareness.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's what I mean by authenticity.
Right.
And people, I know Australians best, and so I'll say Australians have got really good bullshit detectors.
Right.
And so they will line themselves up with people who they think are fair dinkum. But if they think people are having a go at them or having them on are inauthentic, you would get a dead bat.
Yes, yeah. So, I mean, going back to, I guess, to my opening, it's not just within education itself, of course, is it, the notion of leadership, but it's the fact that we're actually genuinely informing the leaders of tomorrow, and that the world that they will be in is going to be so different from the world we're in today, and that how do you therefore encourage within early schooling, going back to that notion, the idea of authenticity and self-awareness?
I think good teachers do this pretty much automatically by showing respect to the individuals that they're working with. And not many teachers totally didactic in the way they approach things anymore, especially at, say, primary school level, where a lot of these opportunities and propensities are laid down, I'm quite convinced. So good teachers provide little leadership opportunities in the classroom and in the school community, and those things are built into the fabric of the way schools work these days. And I think school communities are very good at supporting them, regardless of what's going on around them. So those sorts of things are really important. But as kids get older, they need to develop some sort of, well, not theory, but but some sort of abstract understanding of what they're doing as well, to be able to reflect on it. And so in a lot of ways this is about being inducted into traditions. I mean, our traditions no less influential, no less important in modern society compared with traditional society. So I think as students start to find the curriculum spreading out into disciplines, like instead of just doing sort of social studies, they start to do some history and some geography, and they start to do some English literature, and they start to do some physics and chemistry, and things start to move to that level of their education. They're really being introduced to a whole world of ways of seeing and doing, and that leads me into a sort of a broad perspective on how things change, being at the centre of students learning to be leaders. And I think it's very important for anybody who wants to lead to have an understanding of how things can change, because leadership's fundamentally about desired change, and I'm not sure that we're that good at that part of schooling at this stage. I don't know how you found it, because you've worked in the sort of futures zone, and I think that's an area that's developed a lot over the last 20 or 30 years, and I think it's found its way into schools in bits and pieces, and that's probably loaded with some principles about how things change and how things stay the same, but I think it stands out really as an example.
I think for me what it's revealed is somewhat less than fortunate. I think that what it reveals is people are extraordinarily non-imaginative and quite conservative. So it's and linear and all those things. So that people extrapolate into the future rather than trying to anticipate something that's going to be absolutely different. Yeah. And that's always a disappointment for me.
And I guess that leads to less focus on what we do now in order to create a positive future, I suppose.
One of the interesting things, I have a 8-year-old grandson amongst my tribe of grandchildren, and he is currently living with me, with his mum. And he came to me the other day and he said, "Grandad, could you help me with a school project for Expo?" I said, "Oh, what's an Expo?" This is 8-year-old. And he said, "We all illustrate our scientific..." What? I said, "What's yours?" He said, "Friction." I said, "What?" I didn't know the word friction until I was about 20. Yeah. And he had checked up on the internet a way of making what's essentially a hovercraft using a balloon and a valve and a piece of cardboard. Yeah. So we built this thing, and I went to the expo, and it was filled with all sorts of different inventions.
And that sort of thing used to be for first-year engineering students at university.
Is that right? Yeah.
Yeah. So that's part of my thinking about the introduction of students into traditions, and I think we've got much better at it, and I think it's much more real rather than the sort of, as you say, rote learning that you and I might have experienced a lot of.
I think one of the things I think also that I've uncovered in the work that I've been doing to my satisfaction is people's inability to deal with two vital issues. One is uncertainty, that so much in family life and in school is directed towards a level of certainty. This is what's going to happen. And the other one is the simplification, that we always tend to try and simplify stuff all the time. In the last episode we were talking about COVID and talking about the magic bullet that's the vaccine, and people saying, well, that's the silver bullet, that's it. You know, we fixed it. As if we had, which of course we haven't. And when it comes to something like climate change, that it's so complex. So the classrooms of today, in universities as well as schools, are they really dealing with those issues of uncertainty and complexity?
I think there's lots of examples where they are, and of course lots of parts where they aren't, and that's a sort of obvious thing to say. But I don't know whether it's better now than it was, or worse than it was, or the same. I really don't know. But I do think that the tendency for people to be a bit conservative, I think that's sort of what you're suggesting, is understandable in a circumstance where a lot of the sort of life world that people live in, particularly for young people, has been eroded by the loss of community in all sorts of forms. And I think there's a lot of trepidation, a lot of real worry and a lot of sense of where are the norms, what can I be certain about in my environment. So I don't really find it surprising that people are seeking certainty rather than sort of being very imaginative and striving for some sort of fantastic future. I think this is a bit of the nature of the times that we're in.
Well, I mean, the terms of times we're in, I was at school, in primary school, just at the end of the Second World War, and the post-war period in Britain, which was an extraordinarily austere and pretty awful time.
Yeah.
But we were certain about we never wanted war anymore.
Yeah.
I mean, that came through everything, and so there was a touchstone.
Yes.
That life is better because we're no longer at war.
Yeah, but there's also that sense that there are a lot of people look back on that time and it was the happiest time of their lives. And it strikes me that it was because there was a sort of a consensus in the community that we knew what we were fighting for. We knew what we had to do and we were all in it together. And it was a very intense sort of period. We lack that in a lot of ways now.
Yes.
And, I've noticed it with my own sons, that they really worry about the future of, say, the environment. And they see a depleted future in a lot of ways, and they've made quite deliberate decisions not to have children.
Is that right?
On the basis of that.
Wow.
And I think there's a lot
That's authenticity, if ever there was.
Yes.
That's extraordinary.
I mean, you never know, circumstances might alter and that may change, but that's certainly the way they think. And I remember thinking a bit like that too during the Cold War, when the nuclear threat was quite heightened, thinking you wouldn't want to bring kids into this world. It's hard to imagine, really, that it could have been worse than it is at the moment.
Well, I'm obviously very grateful that my parents didn't make that sort of decision because they came through my father. They came through the First World War, the Great Depression, the Second World War.
Amazing generation.
And they still were optimistic enough to have children. Don, it's been a delight talking to you. Thanks so much. We've covered a whole lot of ground in a very short time, and I hope that in the future we can have you back again and explore in more detail some of the things you've raised.
Thanks very much.
And thank you all for listening, and I look forward to meeting you again in our next episode. From me, Richard Borden, goodbye.